The bride Clara was crying when she married 70-year-old widower Arthur. But on their wedding night, he disappeared into the bathroom and returned as a young stranger with a penetrating gaze. Her world was shaken. Who was he? And why did her poor family suddenly have a chance at new life? An intrigue unfolds in the Nebraska countryside, where lies hide the truth and justice awaits its time. Clara Bennett stood in front of the cracked mirror in her family's cramped trailer, her hands trembling as she adjusted the faded white dress she'd borrowed from a neighbor. At 22, she'd never pictured her wedding day like this. Tears streaking her freckled cheeks, her stomach knotted with dread. Outside, the dusty plains of Ogden, Nebraska, stretched endlessly under a gray March sky, the wind rattling the tin roof of their home. It was March 31st, 2025, a date she'd never forget, though not for the reasons most brides remember their weddings. Clara wasn't marrying for love. She was marrying to save her family. The Bennetts were drowning in poverty. Her father, William, a wiry man with calloused hands and a perpetual cough, spent his days fixing beat-up tractors for farmers who paid him in spare change or IOUs. Her mother, Anne, hunched over a second-hand sewing machine late into the night, stitching patches onto worn-out clothes for a few dollars here and there. Clara's younger brother, Owen, just 17, was a scrawny kid with big dreams and a bigger cough. Too sick to work most days, too stubborn to admit it. They lived paycheck to paycheck, if you could call it that, in a trailer that creaked with every gust of wind, the propane heater sputtering on its last legs. Eviction notices piled up on the kitchen counter next to empty soup cans. Clara had grown up knowing hunger, skipping meals so Owen could eat, lying awake at night, counting the cracks in the ceiling, while dreaming of a day they wouldn't have to scrape by. That dream felt further away than ever when Arthur Reynolds entered their lives. Arthur was 70, a stooped figure with a shock of white hair and deep-set wrinkles that carved his face like a roadmap of hard years. He owned half the farmland around Ogden, a widower with no kids and a reputation for being a recluse. Clara had seen him around town, shuffling into the general store where she worked the register, buying bread or a tin of coffee, always leaving a generous tip she'd tuck in her apron with a forced smile. He'd started coming in more often over the past few months, his pale blue eyes lingering on her a little too long, his gravelly voice softening when he said her name. "Clara, you're a good girl," he'd mutter, and she'd nod, unsure what to make of it. Then, one chilly evening, he'd waited until her shift ended and approached her outside the store. "I've got a proposition," he'd said, leaning on his cane. "Marry me, Clara. I've got money, enough to pull your family out of this hole. New house, medical care for your brother, a fresh start. You won't have to worry no more." His words hit her like a punch. She'd stammered, searching his weathered face for a trick, but he'd just handed her a basket of groceries. Fresh apples, a loaf of bread, things they hadn't tasted in months, and told her to think it over. That night, she'd lain awake, the weight of his offer pressing down on her chest. She didn't love Arthur. She barely knew him. But she saw her father's tired eyes, her mother's bent back, Owen's frail frame. Could she say no? Her parents begged her not to do it. "You're too young, Clara," William rasped, his voice breaking. "We'll figure something out," and clutched her hand, tears spilling over. "We don't want you selling yourself for us." But Clara shook her head, her jaw set. "You've given up everything for me and Owen. It's my turn now." Owen, red-eyed and furious, stormed out of the trailer, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. "He's old enough to be your grandpa," he'd yelled. But Clara had made up her mind. She'd be the soldier marching into battle, not for herself, but for them. The wedding was a blur, a quick ceremony in the town's crumbling chapel, a handful of curious neighbors whispering in the pews, Arthur in a stiff black suit that hung loose on his thin frame. Clara's dress scratched her skin, the bouquet of wildflowers trembling in her grip. She said, "I do," with a voice that barely rose above a whisper, tears spilling as she walked down the aisle on Arthur's arm. The guests thought it was joy. She knew it was fear. That night, Arthur drove her to his sprawling farmhouse on the edge of town, a place that loomed against the horizon with its peeling paint and sagging porch. Inside, it was grander than anything she'd ever seen. Polished wood floors, a chandelier dripping with cobwebs, a fireplace big enough to stand in. Servants nodded at her as they carried her single suitcase upstairs, their eyes darting away when she tried to meet them. She felt like an intruder, her scuffed boots absurd against the luxury. Arthur squeezed her hand, his grip cold but steady. "You'll get used to it," he said softly. "Rest now. It's been a long day." Exhausted, Clara retreated to the bedroom he'd shown her, a massive space with a four-poster bed and heavy curtains that blocked out the moonlight. She collapsed onto the mattress, still in her dress, letting the silence wash over her. For a moment, she thought she might sleep, but then she heard it, a faint sound like water trickling through a pipe, coming from the bathroom down the hall. She sat up, her heart ticking faster. The noise grew louder, insistent, a steady rush that cut through the stillness of the house. Was Arthur okay? He was old, older than her father by a decade. What if he'd fallen, hurt himself? Barefoot, she padded to the door, her nightgown brushing her knees as she stepped into the darkened hallway. A sliver of light spilled from under the bathroom door, flickering like a candle. "Arthur," she called, her voice small, afraid to shatter the quiet. No answer, just the sound of water, sharper now like a faucet left running full blast. She knocked, her knuckles barely grazing the wood. "Arthur, you all right?" Still nothing. Swallowing hard, she turned the knob and pushed. The door swung open, and Clara stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. Standing there wasn't the hunched, white-haired man she'd married hours ago. It was a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair falling over his forehead and sharp green eyes that locked onto hers. His skin was smooth, unlined, his posture strong and sure. He couldn't have been more than 30. A faint smile played on his lips as he stepped toward her, water dripping from his hands like he'd just washed them. "Clara," he said, his voice low and warm, not the gravelly rasp she knew. "Don't be afraid." Her legs buckled, and she gripped the wall to steady herself, her mind spinning. Who are you?" she choked out, her voice a ragged whisper. The man raised his hands, palms out, as if to calm her. "It's me," he said. "Let me explain." But Clara's world was already tilting, the floor slipping out from under her. She'd married Arthur Reynolds, or so she thought. Now, staring at this stranger in her husband's house, she realized nothing was what it seemed. Clara Bennett stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway of Arthur Reynolds' sprawling farmhouse, her bare feet rooted to the cold hardwood floor. The man before her, this stranger with dark hair and piercing green eyes, wore a faint, disarming smile that only deepened her confusion. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, her hands trembling as they clutched the thin fabric of her nightgown. Just hours ago, she'd married a 70-year-old widower, a man with white hair and a cane, a man she'd sacrificed her future for to save her family. Now this figure stood in his place, dripping wet from the bathroom, his voice smooth and steady. "Clara, don't be afraid," he said again, stepping closer. "It's me." "You're not Arthur," she rasped, her voice breaking as she backed away, her shoulder brushing the wall. Panic clawed at her chest. "Where's my husband? What did you do to him?" Her mind raced with dark possibilities. Had this man hurt Arthur? Was she trapped in this house with a lunatic? She glanced toward the bedroom door, calculating how fast she could run, but her legs felt like lead. The man raised his hands higher, a gesture of surrender, water still glistening on his fingertips. "Clara, please. Sit down. I'll explain everything." He nodded toward a plush armchair in the corner of the hall, its velvet faded but inviting. She didn't move, her eyes darting over his face, searching for anything familiar. The stooped posture, the weathered lines, the tired blue eyes she'd stared into during the vows. There was nothing. This man was young, vibrant, his jaw strong, and his gaze sharp. Yet his voice, there was something in its cadence, a warmth she couldn't place. "Who are you?" she demanded, her words sharper now, fueled by a mix of fear and fury. "Tell me, or I swear I'll scream until someone hears me." He sighed, lowering his hands slowly, as if resigned. "My name's Nathan Crowe," he said, meeting her gaze head-on. "I'm not Arthur Reynolds, not the real one anyway. Arthur was my grandfather. He died a year ago, left me everything, his land, his money, his legacy. I've been pretending to be him." Clara blinked, her breath hitching. Pretending? The word felt heavy, absurd. "What the hell are you talking about? I married him, today. I saw him. He was old." She stopped, her mind catching up to her words, replaying the day. Arthur's slow shuffle, his raspy voice, the way he'd leaned on that cane. It had all seemed so real. "Ow!" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Nathan reached up, running a hand through his damp hair, and for the first time, she noticed a faint smudge of gray at his temple. Makeup, she realized, streaked by water. Theater tricks, he said with a wry smile. Wigs, prosthetics, a little padding under the clothes. I studied acting in college. Turns out it's useful for more than just plays. I've been living as Arthur for months, keeping up appearances while I figured things out. Figure what out? Clara snapped, her fear giving way to anger. Why would you do this? Why me? She took a step toward him now, her fists clenched, her tears drying into hot streaks on her cheeks. You tricked me into marrying you. You made me think I was giving up my life for some old man who... She choked on the words, the weight of her sacrifice crashing over her again. Nathan's smile faded, replaced by something softer, almost pained. I didn't mean to hurt you, Clara. It was a test. My grandfather left me a letter with his will. He'd met you years ago at the store. You helped him carry his bags to his truck when his hands were shaking too bad to manage. Didn't even ask for a dime, just smiled and told him to have a good day. He never forgot that. Said you had a heart worth more than all his money. He wanted me to find you, to see if you were still that person. Clara stared at him, her anger faltering as a hazy memory surfaced. An old man with a heavy sack of groceries, her arms aching after a long shift, but offering to help anyway. She'd done it 100 times for 100 people. It hadn't seemed special. So what? She said, her voice quieter now. You dressed up like him to spy on me. To see if you'd marry me, him, for the right reasons, Nathan corrected, his tone earnest. Not for greed, but for something bigger. And you did, Clara. You said yes to save your family, not yourself. That's why I went through with it. She shook her head, reeling. You lied to me, to my parents, my brother. You let me cry through that wedding. Let me think I was tying myself to a stranger twice my age. Her voice cracked, and she turned away, pressing her palms to her eyes, as if she could block out the betrayal. You don't get to decide what my reasons are worth. You're right, Nathan said softly, and the admission caught her off guard. She glanced back at him, saw the guilt flicker in his eyes. I messed up. I should have told you sooner. But there's more, something bigger than just us. He paused, his jaw tightening. Your family's been cheated, Clara, for years, and I can help you fix it. She frowned, lowering her hands. What are you talking about? Lester Green, Nathan said, his voice dropping to a low, serious note. The banker in town. You know him, handles all the loans, the mortgages around here. He's been skimming from people like your folk for decades. Fudging numbers, forging papers. Your dad's been paying off a debt that shouldn't even exist. I found the records in my grandfather's files. Proof Green's been bleeding families dry, keeping them trapped. Clara's stomach twisted. Lester Green was a fixture in Ogden, a slick man in a cheap suit, always smiling too wide when he shook hands at the bank. She remembered her father cursing his name after late-night arguments over bills, her mother whispering about extra fees they couldn't fight. You're saying he stole from us? She asked, her voice trembling with a new kind of rage. More than stole, Nathan said. He's built his whole career on it. My grandfather suspected it, started digging before he got sick. I've got the evidence, contracts, ledgers, signatures that don't match. We could take him down, Clara. Legally. Get your family what they're owed. She stared at him, her mind a whirlwind. The man she'd married wasn't just a liar. He was offering her a way out, a chance to right a wrong she hadn't even known existed. But trust him? After this? Her eyes narrowed. Why should I believe you? You've been playing me like a pawn since day one. Nathan stepped closer, his gaze steady. Because I've seen what you're made of. You're not just some girl from Ogden. You're a fighter. And I'm not asking you to forgive me yet. I'm asking you to fight with me. For your family. For justice. Clara's breath caught, her anger clashing with a spark of something else. Hope? Maybe. Or defiance. She thought of her father's cough, her mother's tired hands, Owen's lost dreams. Lester Green had taken more than money. He'd taken their future. And now this man, this stranger she'd married under false pretenses, was handing her a weapon to take it back. But at what cost? Prove it, she said finally, her voice hard. Show me the proof. Then we'll see. Nathan nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Tomorrow. I'll get everything. But Clara, Green's not going to go down easy. He's got power here. You need to be ready. She met his eyes, her resolve hardening. I've been ready my whole life. The morning sun barely pierced the thick clouds hanging over Ogden, Nebraska, casting a dull gray light through the farmhouse windows. Clara Bennett sat at the edge of the massive oak dining table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold. Across from her, Nathan Crowe spread out a mess of papers, yellowed contracts, scribbled ledgers, and bank statements stamped with dates going back years. His dark hair was still damp from a restless night, his green eyes sharp with focus. Clara's mind churned, replaying his words from hours ago. Lester Green's been cheating your family. We can take him down. She wanted to believe him, but trust was a jagged pill to swallow after his deception. See this? Nathan said, sliding a document toward her. His finger tapped a line of numbers next to her father's name, William Bennett. This loan your dad took out in 2015 for the trailer repairs. $5,000, right? Green tacked on interest that doesn't match the contract, nearly triple what it should be. And here, he flipped to another page, a grainy photocopy of signature. That's not your dad's handwriting. Green forged it to lock you into payments you never agreed to. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching as she traced the shaky scrawl. She'd seen her father sign enough grocery receipts to know his steady, blocky letters. This was a sloppy imitation, a lie in ink. Her stomach twisted with a slow-burning anger. He's been stealing from us, she whispered, the reality sinking in. She thought of William hunched over the kitchen table, counting coins to pay bills that never seemed to shrink, her mother's quiet sobs when they sold her grandmother's ring to cover late fees. Lester Green hadn't just taken their money. He'd stolen their hope. There's more, Nathan said, his voice low. Dozens of families, all the same pattern. Green's been running this scam since my grandfather was alive, padding loans, faking defaults, pocketing the difference. Arthur caught on, started collecting proof, but he got too sick to finish it. That's why he wanted me to find you, Clara. He knew you'd fight. She looked up, meeting his gaze. The sincerity in his eyes clashed with the sting of his earlier lie, pretending to be Arthur, tricking her into marriage. And you think I'll just jump in with you? She said, her tone edged with defiance. After everything, Nathan leaned back, hands raised. I don't expect you to trust me blind. I'm asking you to trust the evidence. We got a shot to make this right, for your family, for everyone he's hurt. But we need to move fast. Green's got eyes all over Ogden. If he catches wind of this, he'll bury it. Clara's jaw tightened. She thought of Owen, coughing through the night in their drafty trailer, of her parents' weary faces. She'd married a stranger to save them. Could she walk away from a chance to fix this, even if it meant leaning on Nathan? What's the plan? She asked finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside. Nathan's lips twitched into a half-smile. We dig deeper, find every scrap of proof we can. I've got a lawyer friend in Lincoln who'll take the case pro bono if we bring him something solid. Then we hit Green, where hurts, court. The next few days blurred into a frenzy. Clara pored over the documents with Nathan, her cashier's eye for numbers spotting discrepancies he'd missed, hidden fees, duplicated charges. She remembered snatches of conversations from the store. Farmers grumbling about Green's deals, widows like Mrs. Harper saying they'd lost homes over debts they didn't owe. Nathan drove her to the county records office, where they photocopied old files under the clerk's suspicious stare. Each night, they returned to the farmhouse, spreading their haul across the table, piecing together a web of fraud that stretched back decades. But the walls of Ogden were closing in. On the third day, Clara stepped out of the store after her shift, the wind biting at her cheeks, when a shadow fell across her path. Lester Green stood there, his cheap suit wrinkled, his smile too wide to be real. Clara Bennett, he drawled, tipping his hat. Heard you've been cozying up with that Reynolds fella. Hope you're not stirring trouble. Her pulse quickened, but she squared her shoulders. Just living my life, Mr. Green. What's it to you? His eyes narrowed, the smile thinning. Folks who dig where they shouldn't tend to regret it. Your daddy's got enough on his plate. Be a shame if things got worse. He let the thread hang, then turned and sauntered off, leaving Clara's heart hammering. She didn't tell Nathan right away. She didn't want him thinking she was scared. But that night, as they sorted papers by lamplight, she caught his gaze. Green knows something, she said quietly. He stopped me today. Said we'd regret it. Nathan's face darkened. He's bluffing, trying to spook you. But we need to be careful. He's got pull with the sheriff, the tax office. If he moves against us, we've got to be ready. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just fighting for her family now. She was fighting a system that had crushed people like them for too long. But doubt gnawed at her. Green wasn't some small-time crook. He was a pillar of Ogden, a man who'd built his life on others' ruin. Could they really win? She thought of her parents' trailer, the eviction notice pinned to the door, Owen's frail frame. Walking away wasn't an option. The next morning, Nathan's phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. Need more. Something airtight. Court won't touch it without a smoking gun. Clara's stomach sank. They had stacks of papers, but nothing definitive enough to nail Green in front of a judge. What now? She asked, her voice tight. Nathan rubbed his jaw, thinking. My grandfather kept a safe, old combination lock hidden in the basement. He hinted at it in his letter, said it held the key. I never cracked it. Figured it was just sentimental junk. But maybe... Clara's eyes lit up. Let's check it. They descended into the farmhouse basement, a damp, shadowy space cluttered with dusty crates and cobwebs. Nathan knelt by a rusted safe tucked behind a shelf, spinning the dial with practiced flicks. Clara held her breath, the air thick with anticipation. After 3 tries, a click echoed, and the door creaked open. Inside lay a single envelope, sealed with wax, marked Lester Green, proof. Nathan tore it open, revealing a handwritten ledger, dates, amounts, and a signed confession from Green's old assistant, admitting to the forgeries under his boss's orders. Dated 2018, notarized, undeniable. Holy hell, Nathan breathed, handing it to Clara. This is it. She clutched the paper, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with fire. He's done, she said, her voice low and fierce. We've got him. But as they climbed the stairs, a new sound stopped them cold, tires crunching gravel outside. Through the window, Clara saw a black SUV, its engine idling. Green's voice carried on the wind, sharp and smug, talking to a man in a sheriff's uniform. Nathan grabbed her arm. He's here. We need to hide this now. Clara's heart raced. The fight was on, and the stakes had never been higher. Clara Bennett's breath caught in her chest as she peered through the farmhouse window, the cold glass fogging under her exhale. Outside, the black SUV gleamed under the dim porch light, its engine growling like a beast ready to pounce. Lester Green stood beside it, his cheap suit catching the wind, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to Sheriff Tompkins, a burly man with a badge pinned to his chest and a smirk Clara knew too well. Nathan's grip tightened on her arm, his whispered stay calm barely audible over the thudding of her heart. In her hands, she clutched the envelope from the safe, the notarized ledger, the confession, their smoking gun against Green. They found it minutes ago, but now it felt like a ticking bomb. He's not here to chat, Clara said, her voice a shaky hiss. He knows we got something. The crunch of gravel grew louder as Green and the sheriff stepped closer to the porch, their shadows stretching across the dusty ground. She could hear Green's smug drawl now. Just a friendly visit, Tompkins. Make sure the newlyweds ain't stirring up nonsense. Nathan pulled her back from the window, his eyes darting to the basement stairs. We need to hide it. If they get in and find this, it's gone, along with our shot. He grabbed a leather satchel from the table, shoving the envelope inside, then yanked open a drawer, pulling out a small recorder. Plan B, he muttered, pressing record and slipping it into his pocket. If he talks, we've got him on tape. Clara nodded, her mind racing. She darted to the fireplace, prying loose a loose brick her fingers had brushed earlier while cleaning. An old hiding spot, maybe Arthur's. She stuffed the satchel into the hollow, jamming the brick back just as a sharp knock rattled the front door. Nathan shot her a look. Ready? And she squared her shoulders, wiping sweaty palms on her jeans. Let's see what he wants, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The door creaked open, and Green's smile slithered into view, too wide, too practiced. Evening, Mrs. Reynolds, or whatever you're calling yourself now, he said, tipping his hat. Sheriff Tompkins loomed behind him, thumbs hooked in his belt. Mind if we come in? Got a tip about some disturbances. Nathan stepped forward, blocking the threshold. No warrant, no entry, he said coolly. What's this about, Green? Green's eyes flicked past him to Clara, narrowing. Oh, just looking out for the community. Heard you tubing snooping where you don't belong. Dangerous hobby, that. His tone dripped with menace, and Clara's stomach twisted. She could feel the recorder in Nathan's pocket whirring, catching every word. Your folks, Clara, William and, they're in a fragile spot. Be a shame if the bank called in that loan early, or if the tax man found some irregularities. Her fists clenched, nails digging into her palms. You've been bleeding us dry for years, she spat, unable to hold back. We know what you've done, forging papers, stealing from people who trusted you. Green's smile faltered, then hardened. Big words for a cashier girl. You got proof, or just a wild imagination. He leaned closer, his breath sour. Back off, or your little family's trailer's the first thing I foreclose on. Sheriff here's got my back, right, Tompkins? The sheriff grunted, a lazy affirmation, but Nathan's voice cut through, calm and cold. Threatening us in front of witnesses, Lester? Bold move. Hope you've got a good lawyer. Green's eyes flashed with something. Panic, maybe, but he recovered fast, stepping back with a chuckle. Enjoy your night, he said, turning away. Won't be so cozy for long. As the SUV roared off, Clara slumped against the wall, her knees weak. He's scared, she said, more to convince herself than Nathan. He wouldn't show up like this if he wasn't. He's desperate, Nathan agreed, pulling the recorder from his pocket and stopping it. This'll help, but the ledger's our ace. We're taking it to Lincoln tomorrow. My lawyer's ready to file. The drive to Lincoln the next morning was tense, the satchel wedged between Clara's feet as Nathan navigated the winding roads. Her mind replayed Green's threats, the sheriff's smirk. By noon, they sat in a cluttered office with Jake Hensley, Nathan's lawyer, a wiry man with glasses perched on his nose. He pored over the ledger, the confession, the recording, his frown deepening into a grin. This is gold, he said. Green's cooked. I'll draft the suit. Fraud, extortion, forgery. We'll hit him with everything. But Green didn't wait. 2 days later, tax agents swarmed the Bennett's trailer, flipping furniture and barking questions about unreported income. William called Clara, his voice hoarse with panic. They're saying we owe thousands. Gonna seize the place. She raced home, finding her parents shell-shocked, Owen coughing into a rag. It's Green, she told them, her voice trembling with fury. He's hitting back. Nathan arrived an hour later, his face grim. He's pulling strings, sheriff, tax office, all of them. But Jake's fast-tracking the case. Court's in 3 days. We hold on till then. Those 3 days stretch like years. Clara stayed with her family, sleeping on the trailer's lumpy couch, jumping at every car that passed. Nathan kept watch at the farmhouse, guarding their evidence. The night before the hearing, she sat with Owen, his thin hand in hers. You're gonna win, right? He asked, his voice raspy. She squeezed his hand. Yeah, kid, we're gonna win. The courtroom in Lincoln was a stark contrast to Ogden's dusty streets. Polished wood, air thick with tension. Clara sat beside Nathan, her borrowed blazer stiff on her shoulders, as Jake laid out their case. The judge, a stern woman with gray streaks in her hair, listened as he presented the ledger, the confession, the recording of Green's threats. Green sat across the room, his suit crisp now, his lawyer whispering furiously. The jury, 12 strangers, watched with unreadable faces. When Clara took the stand, her voice shook at first, then steadied. Lester Green didn't just steal money, she said, her eyes locked on the jury. He stole years from my family, years of my dad, working himself sick, my mom crying over bills we couldn't pay, my brother missing out on childhood. He bet we'd never fight back. He was wrong. She glanced at Nathan, saw his nod, and felt a surge of strength. Green's lawyer tried to spin it, called the documents fabrications, painted Clara as a gold digger, but the evidence held firm. The jury deliberated for hours, the clock ticking past midnight. Clara paced the hall, Nathan beside her, until the bailiff called them back. The judge's voice rang out. On all counts, guilty. Clara's knees buckled, relief crashing over her like a wave. Nathan caught her arm, his grin wide. Green's head dropped, his empire crumbling in that single word. The fight wasn't over. Not yet, but they'd struck the blow that mattered. The courtroom in Lincoln fell silent as the judge's gavel struck, the word guilty still echoing in Clara Bennett's ears. She sat frozen on the wooden bench, her hands gripping the edge so tight her knuckles whitened. Across the room, Lester Green slumped in his chair, his once smug face drained of color, his crisp suit now a wrinkled shell. The jury filed out, their verdict sinking in: fraud, extortion, forgery, decades of deceit unraveled in a single night. Nathan Crowe sat beside her, his hand brushing hers in quiet reassurance. It was March 31st, 2025, just past midnight, exactly 1 week since she'd married a stranger she thought was Arthur Reynolds. Now, that stranger was her ally, and their fight had changed everything. Clara's chest heaved with a shaky breath, relief mingling with exhaustion. She'd done it, they'd done it. Green's empire of lies had crumbled, and with it, the weight that had crushed her family for years. Nathan leaned closer, his voice low. "You okay?" She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. The judge outlined Green's fate: prison time, restitution to his victims, his banking license revoked. As deputies led him away, his glare flicked to Clara, a final, impotent jab from a man who'd lost it all. She met it head-on, her chin lifting. He didn't own her anymore. The next morning broke cold and clear over Ogden, Nebraska, the plains stretching golden under a rare burst of sunlight. Clara stood outside her family's trailer, the eviction notice gone from the door, replaced by a letter from a court. Inside, William and Ann pored over it, their tired faces lit with disbelief. "They're giving us back the money," William rasped, his cough quieter now, softened by hope. "Every cent Green took, plus damages. Enough to fix this place, or get a new one." And clutched his hand, tears streaking her cheeks, and pulled Clara into a fierce hug. "You saved us, baby," she whispered. Owen, still pale but grinning, punched her arm lightly. "Told you you'd win." But the victory went beyond the Bennetts. Nathan's lawyer, Jake Hensley, had turned their case into a beacon. Other families in Ogden came forward, their own stories of Green scams spilling out. The court ordered a full audit of his records, unearthing a trail of victims stretching across the county. Restitution checks began arriving, small but meaningful lifelines for people who'd lost homes, farms, dreams. Clara watched it unfold from the general store, her cashier shifts now buzzing with gratitude instead of grumbles. Mrs. Harper, the widow who'd lost her house, pressed a homemade pie into her hands one day. "You gave me my life back," she said, her voice trembling. Clara just smiled, her throat tight. Nathan hadn't disappeared after the trial. He stayed in Ogden, trading the farmhouse's grandeur for a simpler routine, helping Clara sort through the aftermath, meeting her family properly this time. One evening, as they sat on the trailer's rickety porch, the sky bruising purple with dusk, he turned to her. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, his green eyes steady. "I started this with a lie, pretending to be Arthur, testing you. I thought I was honoring my grandfather's wish, but I didn't see what it had cost you. I am sorry, Clara." "Really?" She studied him, the man who'd upended her world and then helped her rebuild it. The anger she'd carried had faded, worn down by his actions. The way he'd fought beside her, risked his inheritance to take down Green. "You lied," she said softly, "but you stayed. You didn't have to. That counts for something." She paused, then added, "Why me, though? Out of everyone." Nathan smiled, a little sad, a little warm. "Grandfather saw you that day at the store, helping him with those bags, not knowing who he was. He said you had a light in you, something rare. He was right. I saw it too, the way you fought for your family, for what's right. I didn't just want to test you, Clara. I wanted to know you." Her heart stuttered, caught between the past week's chaos and this quiet moment. She'd married him under false pretenses, but the man beside her now was real, flawed, earnest, and tied to her by more than a ring. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely above the cricket's hum. Nathan took her hand, tentative. "We start over. No tricks, no masks. I'd like to be with you. For real, if you'll have me. And I've got something else." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, a deed. "Bought a little place down the road. Nothing fancy, but it's for your folks. Fresh start, like I promised." Clara's breath hitched. She unfolded it, seeing her parents' names in bold print. A modest house with a porch and a yard. Tears spilled over, and she laughed, a sound of pure release. "You're full of surprises, Nathan Crowe." "Only the good kind from now on," he said, grinning. She leaned into him, their shoulders brushing, and for the first time in years, the future felt wide open. Weeks later, the Bennetts moved into their new home, a cozy single-story with white siding and a chimney puffing smoke. Clara helped unpack, hanging curtains with, and watching Owen explore his own room with a rare burst of energy. William's cough eased with proper medicine, funded by the restitution, his hands steadier as he tinkered with a neighbor's tractor for fun, not survival. The trailer stayed behind, a relic of a life they'd outgrown. Claire didn't stop there. With Nathan's support and a chunk of the damages, she started a small fund at the store, offering free advice and legal referrals to folks facing financial traps like Green's. She called it Second Chances, a name that stuck as word spread. People came with their own crumpled papers, their own stories, and she listened, pointing them to help. It wasn't big, but it was hers, a way to turn her fight into something lasting. One evening, as spring crept into Ogden, Clara stood with Nathan outside the new house, the air sweet with budding lilacs. The sun dipped low, painting the plains gold as she squeezed his hand. "I thought I was sacrificing everything that night," she said, her voice soft. "Turns out it led me here, to this." Nathan pulled her close, his arm warm around her shoulders. "You're not a sacrifice, Clara. You're the strongest person I know, and I'm damn lucky you said yes, even if it was to the wrong guy at first." She laughed, resting her head against him. Their story wasn't perfect, built on a lie, forged in a courtroom, but it was theirs. Green faced his consequences, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone else. The families he'd robbed reclaimed their lives, piece by piece. And Clara, once a girl counting cracks in a trailer ceiling, found something bigger: justice, love, a purpose. As the stars blinked on above the Nebraska sky, she knew this wasn't the end, just the beginning of a fight worth winning.